So what tools does the Federal Reserve have at its disposal in order to conduct monetary policy? We take a look at the reserve requirements, the discount rate, and open market operations. So all three of these are under direct control of the Federal Reserve, and they use it in combination with one another in order to pursue the monetary policy that they believe is best for the economy. So let's go ahead and detail each one of these a little bit more in depth and see which one is going to be the main tool that the Fed uses nowadays. So here we take a look at the tools of the Fed. Tools of the Fed. So in terms of tools of the Fed, tool number one are going to be these reserve requirements. Reserve requirements. And we've already hit on this quite often in our previous videos. And basically, these are things that are going to be set by the Fed. It tells that every single bank that is going to be that has to deal with these reserve requirements, they have to hold a minimum amount of their deposits as required reserves. Remember, we have that 1%, 3 to 5%, that 10% depending on the size of the bank. That is in direct control of the Federal Reserve. So what exactly happens when the Federal Reserve decides to change these reserve requirements? So suppose that the Fed raises these requirements. So if the Fed raises reserve requirements, so raises reserve requirements. What exactly does that mean for our economy and the money supply? So if the Fed raises reserve requirements, that tells us that banks have to hold more money as required reserves. And in effect, that tells us banks are going to be able to lend out less money. So banks lend out less money. And as banks lend out less money, that of course has an innate ability of causing the money multiplier to decrease. So here, remember that as banks lend out less money, if they hold more in reserves, that's going to be a leakage. So the money multiplier here is going to decrease. So here, the money multiplier decreases. And it's going to be both the actual and potential money multiplier in this case because it's the reserve requirement. So here, so far, the Fed raises the reserve requirements. Banks lend out less money. The money multiplier is going to decrease. And as the money multiplier decreases, remember, this has a dampening impact on how much money is going to be able to be created. So therefore, the money supply decreases. Money supply decreases. So therefore, as we can see from this entire transition, this channel right here, if the Federal Reserve changes reserve requirements, it's going to cause changes in the money supply. In this case, if they raise reserve requirements, money supply is going to decrease. And as money supply changes, that is one way for the Federal Reserve to conduct its monetary policy. However, changing the reserve requirements isn't something that the Federal Reserve does all too often. They only change it during very tough economic times. And in this case, it is not a very powerful and it's not a very sort of precise tool. So here, they really don't change the reserve requirements. It's not the primary tool that they're going to lean back on in order to conduct monetary policy, but it is something that they have control over. The second tool that we can go ahead and take a look at is the discount rate. So discount rates. And the discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed charges commercial banks to borrow reserves from a regional Fed bank. So this falls back onto the idea that the Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort. So the interest rate, the Fed charges commercial banks. The Fed charges commercial banks to borrow reserves or money from a regional Fed bank. So here, the discount rate, the interest rate the Fed charges commercial banks to borrow reserves from a regional Fed bank. So if the bank runs into very tough economic times, they can always fall back on the Federal Reserve and borrow money from there. We're going to notice that the discount rate is actually a fairly high interest rate. You might assume that, hey, if banks want to borrow from the Federal Reserve, they might charge them a really low interest rate. But the discount rate is actually pretty high compared to the federal funds rate. So here, it's roughly 1% higher than the federal funds rate. So what exactly is the federal funds rate? We'll get a little bit more into this after we do this sort of section right here. But the federal funds rate is the most important interest rate that we talk about. It's essentially what banks charge each other in order to borrow reserves from one another. So if TD Bank needs reserves in order to meet its reserve requirement, they can ask Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo is going to charge them this federal funds rate. So here, the federal funds rate is actually the most important interest rate that we do take a look at. It is basically going to determine all other interest rates within the United States. The discount rate is roughly 1% higher than this federal funds rate. And the reason why it is higher than the federal funds rate is that because the Federal Reserve doesn't want all these commercial banks to continue to rely on the Fed itself. A sort of efficient and productive bank shouldn't need to rely on the Fed at all and should be able to conduct its everyday transactions using normal economic means. So here with the discount rate, this is something that is going to be in complete control of the Federal Reserve, but the federal funds rate is not under the control of the Fed. They can only indirectly influence it. So something to be aware about that. So yes, they have control over the discount rate, but they do not have control over the federal funds rate. So let's go ahead and see the transition with what happens when the Fed conducts some type of changes to our discount rates. So let's go ahead once again. Suppose that the Fed raises discount rates. So Fed raises the discount rate. Raises discount rate. If the Fed raises the discount rate, what does this mean for banks? Banks are going to borrow and lend out less money. So banks will borrow and lend out less money. So number one, if the interest rates go up, that of course tells us that you probably aren't going to want to borrow a lot of money, but they're going to be able to lend out less money as well, just for the same reasons. So with all of this, as they lend out less money, once again, this is going to dampen the impact of money creation, so the money supply decreases. Money supply decreases. And once again, this is going to be another tool that the Fed does have at its disposal, but it's not something that they rely on all too often because it's not a very, very powerful tool. So here, banks don't really borrow money, a lot of money from the Federal Reserve. So although they can change the discount rate, it's not a very powerful tool for conducting monetary policy. So we fall back on the third and final tool, which is going to be the main tool of monetary policy, which is going to be these open market operations. Open market operations. So here we're going to just use a little bit of shorthand right here, OMO. So open market operations, OMOs for short. And this is the buying and selling of U.S. government securities to adjust for reserves in the banking system. So the buying and selling of U.S. government securities, securities, i.e. bonds, government bonds, to adjust reserves in the banking system. Yes, to adjust reserves in the banking system. To adjust reserves in the banking system. So once again, open market operations, the main tool of monetary policy, it's the buying and selling of U.S. government securities to adjust for reserves in the banking system. So essentially, the reason why the Federal Reserve uses open market operations as the main tool of monetary policy is because it is the most powerful tool that they have at their disposal. If they want to put $1 billion of money into the money supply, they just go ahead and buy $1 billion of government bonds. And that's going to pump exactly $1 billion into the money supply. So it's very fast, it's very efficient, and it's a very, very powerful tool. So let's go ahead and see exactly what happens with the transition with these open market operations. Suppose that the Federal Reserve decides to buy bonds. So when Fed buys these securities or these bonds, the special name that we give for a purchase of these bonds is an open market purchase. Open market purchase. So here, when the Federal Reserve decides to buy bonds, it's called an open market purchase, and this is going to cause our money supply to increases. So we can just go ahead and say increase in this instance. So here, the money supply increases. So when the Fed buys bonds, the open market purchase, money supply increases. $100 billion worth of bonds are bought, $100 billion of money supply is pumped in. If we go to the opposite case, if the Fed actually wants to take away money from the banking system or from the economy, they're going to sell bonds instead. So when Fed sells bonds, the special name that we give for this is an open market sale. Open market sale. and boom, money is immediately taken away from the economy. The money supply is going to decrease. So money supply decreases. And what exactly is the Federal Reserve trying to do with these open market operations by buying and selling bonds, by increasing the money supply and decreasing the money supply? The Federal Reserve is trying to directly or indirectly influence the federal funds rate. So that most important interest rate that we were talking about just a short while ago. So Fed uses these open market operations in order to influence the federal funds rate. Federal funds rate. And like we said before, this is the most important interest rate that we have in the US economy. So formally, the federal funds rate is the interest rate that financial institutions charge each other for overnight loans used as reserves. So like we said before, if TD Bank needs reserves, they can go ahead, go to Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo is going to charge them the federal funds rate in order for them to get a little bit of interest for lending them their money. And this is the closely watched interest rate that affects many other interest rates. So essentially, every other single interest rate that we can think about, your mortgage payment, the payment that you make for your car, the interest rate that you're going to go ahead and when you take out a loan, your student loan payments as well, that interest rate there, it's all going to be determined by this federal funds rate. The Federal Reserve, however, cannot directly set the federal funds rate itself. It does not have direct control over it. The only thing that it does is has a particular target for this federal funds rate. So here, they set the target federal funds rate, and then they're going to be using the open market operations in order to alter the supply of money to achieve its particular target. So here, they can only influence where the federal funds rate is heading. They cannot directly set the federal funds rate itself. So remember, the federal funds rate is very different from the discount rate that we just talked about. So here, how exactly is the federal funds rate actually determined? Well, that's just going to be by the forces of supply and demand. So a few things that we want to know. Fed cannot directly set this rate. So they cannot set this rate. They only have a particular target for it. And in the next chapter, we'll learn about the Taylor rule. And that Taylor rule will explicitly tell us how they come up with this particular target. And this federal funds rate, as we already said, it is determined by market forces. Market forces. So essentially, it's going to be supply and demand. Supply and demand. Our good model that we've seen since the beginning of the semester. So with all of this, we know exactly what the Federal Reserve is trying to do with the primary tool of monetary policy with these open market operations. With these open market operations, we can actually extend the analysis that we have here just a little bit because it's going to provide us with a pretty nice foundation for our next chapter. So here, let's go ahead and see how the Federal Reserve is going to go ahead and influence these interest rates or the federal funds rate with open market purchases and open market sales. So suppose that the Federal Reserve conducts an open market purchase. So Fed conducts an open market purchase. An open market purchase. And with an open market purchase, remember that the Federal Reserve is going to be buying bonds. So Fed buys bonds. And as the Federal Reserve buys bonds, we said that the money supply increases. Money supply increases. So just once again, hitting on the same notes that we just wrote down a few seconds ago. So as the Fed conducts an open market purchase, the Fed buys bonds and the money supply increases. So what exactly is that going to have an impact on the interest rates, do you think? So what impact do you think that's going to do on the federal funds rate? As the money supply increases, interest rates are actually going to go ahead and get pushed down. Interest rates go down. Go down. And as interest rates go down, that's going to have a huge impact on the economy, and we'll open this up just a little bit more once we hit our next chapter. But the last thing that we want to go and note about the interest rates going down, what impact do you think this is going to have on bond prices? Bond prices. Remember that there is going to be an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices. So as interest rates go down, bond prices are going to go up. Go up. So here, this is the entire transition that we want to lay out with these open market purchases or these open market sort of operations. As the Fed buys bonds, the money supply increases, interest rates are going to get pushed down as a result. And because there's an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices go up. So here, as we can see, the Federal Reserve is going to go ahead and influence the federal funds rate with this particular open market purchase. And just for completion, just so you guys have this in your notes, we can go the opposite case as well. Suppose that the Fed conducts an open market sale. An open market sale. So with an open market sale, we just go to the opposite case. The Fed sells bonds. And when they sell bonds, that's going to take away money from the economy. So the money supply decreases. Money supply decreases. And as money supply decreases, interest rates go up. Interest rates go up. And then finally here, as interest rates go up, that causes bond prices to go down. So bond prices go down. So here we have the main tool of monetary policy, these open market operations, and you know exactly what the Federal Reserve is trying to do. They're trying to influence these federal funds rate up or down, depending on the economic situation that sort of requires it. And how good do you think the Federal Reserve is actually doing at its job? Let's go ahead and take a closer look at that. Well, the Federal Reserve is actually one organization within the government that's really, really good at doing its job, and you can sort of trust them because they do have the best interest for the economy at mind. So let's go ahead and take a look at this particular chart right here. We have a red line and then we have a blue line. The red line is the target federal funds rate, which is exactly set by the Taylor rule. So this is exactly what they want the federal funds rate to be. And we have the blue line, which is the actual federal funds rate. And as we can see right here, they're nearly superimposed on one another. So if the Federal Reserve wants to lower, if the target tells them to lower the federal funds rate, they're going to go ahead and conduct these open market operations in order to influence that actual federal funds rate down. If they want to raise the rates, then they're going to just go ahead and raise the rate. They're going to influence it by conducting these open market operations once again. So essentially, when they buy bonds, when they conduct an open market purchase, they're going to go ahead and push the interest rates down. And when they sell bonds, the interest rates are going to be pushed up. And we'll go through a bit of a channel with this in the next video. But as you can see from these lines essentially being superimposed on one another, the Federal Reserve is very successful at doing its job and hitting its federal funds rate over the past 30 years. So during the past financial recession, the Great Recession, we noticed that, hey, interest rates should be very, very close to zero. And that's exactly what they did. They conducted a huge open market purchase of bonds, quantitative easing, as they sort of called it. And basically that helped keep interest rates very, very low for a period of time in order for us to get out of the Great Recession. And then that's exactly what they're doing nowadays, once again, to keep interest rates low. So here, since 2020, interest rates have fallen in order to combat the sort of economic effects of COVID-19. So essentially with all of this, we want to go ahead and take a look at the sort of primary channels of monetary policy, these open market operations, just a little bit more, because it's going to give us a very, very good foundation for the next chapter, as well as take a look at how long it's going to be taking any one piece of monetary policy sort of policy to go ahead and impact our own lives. So we'll go ahead and wrap up the chapter by taking a look at those particular concepts.